Good evening. So we start with welcoming the few guests that we have tonight with us. We have Francesca, the daughter of our treasurer. We have Mr. Marieton down there. We have, excuse me, but it's a little difficult. Madame Nathalie Babet. And then there is another guest which I don't find here on my list, which I apologize, and is that lady. And then we have the major surprise and great honor for us this evening, because we have the presence of Ambassador Artem Lipchenko, the Ukrainian ambassador to Switzerland. It's a wonderful surprise, a major honor. The ambassador would like to say something to us, but after the guest speaker has made a certain introduction. So we are extremely fortunate because we were already thrilled and excited at the idea of having a guest who operates in a wide spectrum from Kiev to New York, and Stefano will tell us in which respect, but also to welcome the ambassador to our gathering is a great honor, also because the ambassador just arrived in August in Switzerland, taking his responsibilities, and this is one of his first outing in Geneva, outside of Bern. So a double thanks, a great welcome, and now Stefano can tell us who is going to talk tonight. Thank you.
Does it work? Okay, I would have to do it in English. So good evening to everybody. It's a great honor for us and for me especially to have Irina Palashvili tonight here as our speaker. As you know, she's going to talk about Ukraine, both from a business and cultural standpoint. Just a few words. I started to go to Ukraine, I think first time back in 91 or 92, but we didn't meet with Irina in those days. She was too young. And we met a little bit later, but we have been working together for many years. So I can certainly say that she is one of the best lawyers I've ever met, and certainly one of the best lawyers from Ukraine, and this has been widely recognized in a number of publications, so I'm not saying anything excessive or not correct. And she has been one of the few women also to build up a practice in this country and to make it international in a time and during a period when this was not obvious at all. So she started this practice, especially, between Ukraine and the US. And actually, I think the family is still living in the US and she's going back and forth. And that has given her an opportunity to develop an international clientele during a period of time when Ukraine was expanding its international activities and increasing substantially the number of the value of foreign direct investments in the country. So I think that without being too shy, we can say that she was one of the people who definitely helped the country to open up. She created also an important network of law firms, which is called RULG, which has been active primarily in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And now it was so successful, but in the end, it was taken over by the International Bar Association, which is now organizing the events which in the past were organized by this network. Having said that, I don't want to be too technical, so I don't want to say too much about the legal activities, but I think it's probably worthwhile to mention one thing. that despite the fact that she's originally Georgian, but she grew up and studied in Ukraine, and she's been, ambassador, one of the best ambassadors of your country abroad, because she has actively defended, I would say, the face and the tradition of a new Ukraine. And this is how I have come across to several of her activities, including, I would say, one which is more recent, but also extremely interesting, which is the New Era Orchestra, which unfortunately I have not seen yet, but I've been also a modest supporter of this initiative. So with that, I think I've said enough, and I will give you the floor, and thank you very much for coming.
Buonasera, signore e signori. Mi chiamo Irina Paliashvili. I come from a little beautiful country of Georgia, which is on the Black Sea. Between, I would say, our culture is cross between Mediterranean and Middle Eastern culture. And I came to Ukraine to study in the university. So I grew up in Georgia. And as an outsider who became later naturalized Ukrainian citizen, and also fell in love with Ukraine, with Ukrainian culture, and eventually with Ukrainian men with whom we have been married for 33 years, I really can give both perspectives, outsider and insider at the same time. So the question is why we call our today's theme New Ukraine, Culture and Business. Actually, Ukraine is one of the oldest countries in Europe. You may have heard about Kievan Rus, which was a very powerful, very cultured, prosperous country. Started in 19th to 13th century. And Ukraine is a direct descendant of this country. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, several countries emerged which were disintegrated from the Soviet Union. And because of the Soviet propaganda, and before then Russian propaganda, the world didn't know anything about those countries. And the most important countries out of this group actually was Ukraine, because it's the biggest country, it's the most historic country with the most rich culture and background. So we think that it's very important to spread information about Ukraine, so people find out exactly, what's the background, what's the history. And today, Ukraine is quite prominent, unfortunately in a tragic way, because Ukraine is victim of an aggression of the Russian Federation. Parts of Ukraine were taken away, Crimea, and the other parts, smaller parts, are occupied right now. So we are fighting to get those back. This is not the publicity that we were hoping for, frankly. We would like to be known by our culture. We would like to be known by our business, by trade, by other kinds of factors, but unfortunately that's what's in the newspapers these days. So I want to start with a very quick tour of history of Ukraine. And as I said, the statehood of Ukraine started from the 9th century, and Kievan Rus became a very prosperous and powerful state at that time. First, the religion was pagan, and the princes of Kievan Rus, they realized at some point that in order to become part of European, more sort of progressive, civilized countries, they have to adopt the mono-religion, because the countries around Ukraine already had mono-religion, Christianity, Islam, etc. So they also needed a new law, because Christianity or other religions, they brought with them a legal aspect as well. So in order to join the progressive world, Kievan Rus at that time was ruled by Prince Vladimir, and he was very pragmatic. So he didn't have any special affiliation with any religion, except that his grandma was Olga and she was Christian. But he wanted to find out about all religions and then choose the one that will be more suitable. So he sent ambassadors to Islamic countries, to Christian countries, and the ambassadors came back and they told him what they have seen. And at some point, he even was considering Islam for Ukraine. But then the ambassadors explained that in Islam you cannot drink alcohol and you cannot eat pork. And of course, both were no-no. So Islam didn't happen for Ukraine. And finally, Vladimir has chosen Christianity. And Ukraine became Christian in 988. Vladimir was baptizing in Kiev. He baptized the whole population in the Dnipro River. If you have been to Kiev, it's a spectacular, beautiful city which is divided in the middle by a huge river, Dnipro. And it's so big that there are islands in the middle of the river where you can, live. There are communities built there. So that's where Volodymyr has baptized Rus, and Rus became Christian. And with Christianity came the Christian law. And actually, as a lawyer, I have to point out that Kievan Rus was one of the very first countries in Europe or in the world at that time that codified its legislation. Several princes later, the Kievan Rus justice was a code of law. So there was a written code of law in the 10th century already in Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus was extremely active in international relations. They had ambassadors, they had diplomats, and finally the peak of its glory was under the Yaroslav the Wise, Prince Yaroslav the Wise, and he understood the power not only of military factors, but also the power of diplomacy. He had many children, boys and girls, and he started marrying those children with kings and queens of European countries. So a lot of European dynasties actually have Ukrainians in their foundation. You probably have heard about Anna de Kiev, Anna from Kiev. She was daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, and she married a French king. And she became one of the most important queens in French history. There are monuments of her in Paris. And she ruled, actually, at some point, she ruled the country as a regent because her husband died and the son was too small. So she was ruling France. Other children were married to Hungarian princes all over Europe, basically. This was really the best period in Kievan Rus history. Then, unfortunately, the Mongols came, and in the 13th century, the Mongols destroyed a lot of the principality. And by the way, all of this was happening before Moscow even existed. It was nowhere on the map. It didn't exist. This was already, the end of Kievan Rus. And then one of the princes, who was disinherited son of one of the Kievan princes, and he wasn't happy with his role, so he went north and he founded Moscow. And then, Moscow became a principality, and there was at that time a lot of animosity between those principalities. Sometimes they fought with each other, and sometimes they fought together. So at the end of the day, Principality of Moscow became at some point allies of Mongols, at some point suppressed by them, but they were really working together with them. And Kievan Rus was destroyed. Then, a new good period in Ukrainian history happened in the 16th, 17th century. And this was actually one of the first democratic republics in Europe. This was the Cossack Republic. You probably have heard about Cossacks, Ukrainian Cossacks. Those were free, militarized settlements. They were peasants, but they were militarized, and they were free from any rulers. So they had their own army that they created, and they were choosing their leaders. Their leaders were called hetmans, and they were choosing them. And the funny thing is that, when they found somebody that they wanted to become hetman, they were asking him to become, and he had to refuse. First time he had to say no. Then they had to ask him again, no again, and third time finally he would say yes. That was sort of the procedure. And at that time, the first European democratic constitution was created. As a lawyer, again, I want to point this out. And this was Constitution of Philip Orlik. And this was a democratic constitution. This was a republic. So the Cossacks had a very busy life because not only they were farmers, from time to time they were warriors, and sometimes they fought with Turks, sometimes they fought against Turks, sometimes with Russians, sometimes against Russians, Muscovites at that time, because still Russia didn't exist, it was Moscovia. So when Russia became more powerful and became Russia, it's under Peter I, and then several dynasties later, it was Catherine II. She being an authoritarian ruler, and at that time, Russian Empire being an authoritarian state, they didn't like a free democratic country next to them. So they destroyed the Cossacks, and unfortunately, history repeats itself today. They try, but this time they will not be successful, fortunately. So Catherine the Great destroyed the Cossack Republic. She resettled some of the Cossacks to other parts of Russia. And from that period, 17th century, the darkest stage of Ukrainian history starts, when Ukraine was divided by bits and pieces, some under Russian Empire, some under Poland. The happiest part of Ukraine, I think, was under Austro-Hungarian Empire. As we know, this was a waltzing empire, and they were very loyal to culture and to language. So, they supported Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language. And if you go even today to Western Ukraine, city of Lviv, which under Austro-Hungarian Empire was called Lemberg, I have Austrian friends who came for the first time, and they said, maybe we should never say Lemberg, because this is Austro-Hungarian name. And I said just the opposite. People would love it. When they find out you are from Austria, they're always very welcoming. So you can say Lemberg as much as you want, because Austro-Hungarians were the nicest sort of occupiers. The other ones also that left good memories are Lithuanians. And today Lithuania is a tiny, sweet country in Baltics, but at some point it was an empire. And Lithuanians controlled parts of Ukraine, like in the west. And not long ago, I was in a town about 5 hours drive from Kiev, and they were under everybody, under Poles, under Lithuanians, under Ottomans, under Russians, everybody. It's Kamieniec Podilsky. And I asked them who was the nicest occupier, and they said Lithuanians. So this was going on for several centuries. Unfortunately, the biggest part of Ukraine was under Russian Empire, and that's what really suppressed Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language. Like, anywhere in the empire, if you are from the outskirts and you want to make a big career, if you are a composer, if you are a writer, you have to go to the center, to the metropole. That's where your name becomes big. And a lot of big names that Russia is claiming today, they're actually Ukrainians, like Gogol, for example. He is Ukrainian, he's from Ukraine. So those who stayed behind, that didn't want to go, they were as talented, but they never became world known and they never became so successful. So I recommend very much, there is on YouTube, there is a documentary about classical music of Ukraine, and some Ukrainian musicians, they just made a documentary about all these great composers that are actually Ukrainian, that worked in Ukraine, but nobody knows about them. So now Ukrainians are rediscovering their culture, rediscovering their past, and trying to sort of reconnect with it and present it to the world as well. So after that, unfortunately, even worse period started for Ukraine, and this was the Lenin Revolution, the October Revolution, when Ukraine initially became independent. And unfortunately, it couldn't hold this independence for a long time. The Red Army came, the Bolsheviks came, and Ukrainians fought against the Bolsheviks. They fought very hard, but unfortunately they lost. And because of Ukraine and Poland, this Red Army didn't enter the Western Europe. This was the last barrier. And there is a movie, a Polish movie called 1920. I recommend this movie because it shows the battle between Bolsheviks and Ukrainians and Poles when they stopped the Red Army. I was watching this movie together with Swiss friends, and I told them, you know, this is what saved you from Gulag. This is what saved you from all these horrifying things that happened in the Soviet Union. The barrier, Ukraine and Poland. And unfortunately, most of Ukraine ended up under the Soviet rule. The Bolsheviks took over finally, and then Gulag, you know, millions of Ukrainians, the best ones, you know, the most intelligent, educated ones were taken to Gulag. And then also Stalin organized an artificial hunger, famine. Another 10 million Ukrainians. Yes, yes, in the south, yeah. So 10 million Ukrainians were gone. Then the Second World War. Again, you know, the German army entered from Belarus and crossed Ukraine. So a lot of tragedy there. And then until 91, 92, Ukraine remained under Soviet rule, virtually unknown, like everybody else, but with a small detail. After the Second World War, when the United Nations was created, Stalin wanted more votes. He wasn't happy as a victor in the war, one of the victors. He didn't want just one Soviet vote. So he told Roosevelt and Churchill that, look, you know, Soviet Union is a federal state of 15 free republics. All the republics are free. They can go if they want, you know, they're independent. So they are independent states. And two of them suffered most in the Second World War, Ukraine and Belarus. So I want them to be independent members of the United Nations. And that's what happened. Ukraine and Belarus, together with the Soviet Union, were independent members of the United Nations. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine just stayed in the United Nations. It signed all the treaties before. So, you know, the legal succession was very easy within the United Nations system. Other than that, you know, Ukraine was like everything else in the Soviet Union. It was a jail. I was born and raised in the Soviet Union, so, you know, we couldn't travel, we couldn't communicate, even, you know, if we couldn't talk to foreigners, like I could never talk to you. I was in Moscow once and I was walking in the street and some Finns came to me and asked me for direction. And like a few minutes later, I had like big hand on my shoulder, let's go, who they were, why they ask you questions. So this was this kind of environment. And then in 91, 92, fortunately, this evil empire collapsed and Ukraine emerged or re-emerged as an independent state again. And since then, Ukraine was trying to build a new independent system, legal system, political system, governance system. There is a lot of interference, unfortunately, but Ukraine is fighting back because it's probably the last chance to finally, you know, become free, become independent. And for me as a Georgian, I come from a country which reveres freedom. You know, for Georgians, they die for freedom. Freedom is number one priority. Patria and freedom. Ukraine, because it's Slavic and its language is, you know, closer to Russian, it was Russified much more than Georgia. But you scratch the surface of Ukrainians and you find the same. They're crazy about freedom. I saw a video from the front lines where Ukrainians, you know, are fighting, defending their country, and they were basically, you know, they didn't know if they die tomorrow or not because this was an active battleground. And the reporter was asking them, "What's the most important thing for you?" And I thought they will say family, you know, my kids, my love, my wife. My wife probably was very angry because all of them, they said freedom is most important for us. And they said it in front of death, basically. So you don't lie when you don't know if you survive tomorrow or not. So I think that's one thing that is very common between Georgians and Ukrainians, it's freedom. That, It's very important. But for Ukrainians, because they were suppressed longer, because their language is similar, not similar, but there are similarities, Slavic language as well. I think for Ukrainians it was much more difficult to reclaim their identity, and that's taking much longer time. But two revolutions in my already in modern Ukraine. The first revolution was the Orange Revolution, which happened in 2004. And I was there every day, every evening. There were millions, I don't know, hundreds of thousands. One time was 1.5 million people on Maidan. So that was the first step. And then the second step was when Ukraine planned to sign a association agreement with the European Union. And at that time, our president, Yanukovych, he promised to his people that he will sign. And then at the last moment, he refused to sign it. So Ukrainians who feel that they are part of Europe, they were taken away this opportunity and they came on Maidan again. This was the end of 2013, 2014. And this revolution was not peaceful anymore. 100 people died, were killed, and Ukrainians basically won this second revolution. And Yanukovych defected to Russia. He's still living there in exile. And the new government was elected, the new president was elected, and the association agreement with the European Union was signed. And since then, Ukraine, in its legal system, in its governance system, in its culture and political system, is oriented towards Europe. It takes time, it takes a lot of effort, but that's what we mean by New Ukraine. So it's an ancient country, but resurrected today again as part of Europe. And unfortunately, there is a lot of post-Soviet sort of special interest, post-Soviet mentality. So when we say New Ukraine, it's in contrast with those that still are living in the previous century and still don't understand that the world is global today and people want to be integral part of Europe. And when we talk about New Ukraine, we talk mostly about people. The young generation of Ukrainians is trying to get rid of all this Soviet or post-Soviet problems like fear, for example. Problems like feeling suppressed or not feeling proud of your own heritage. So I see in young people like this is all disappearing, fortunately. And I see New Ukraine in culture, in politics, and in diplomacy as well. I'm very happy to invite Artem today. If he would be this, post-Soviet Ukrainian ambassador who looks like the head of a collective farm and, only speaks with, Soviet cliches, I would never invite him. But Artem is New Ukraine. And it's very important, I think, that we bring people like Artem as our ambassadors. His wife is wonderful, charming, and they're expecting a baby very soon, another Ukrainian baby on Swiss soil. And this you see in everything. We brought here in beginning of September the New Era Orchestra with the help of Stefano and many other Swiss friends and donors in Ukraine and outside. And this is a chamber of orchestra of about 30 musicians, top virtuosos, not known anywhere but in Ukraine. And they made this cultural breakthrough. They were performing at September Musical Festival in Lviv, very successfully, then and there. And I want Western Europeans to see this side of Ukraine, to understand that today is a very aspiring country, that this country full of young people who are not only dreaming but actually implementing their dreams. They don't disappear, they don't leave, they come and go. They study in France or in America, then they come back. For them, the world is global, but for them, the center of their universe still is Ukraine. And that's where we are today. Before we move to business, maybe a few words about business environment. I want Artem to say a few words, how he's feeling here in Switzerland, and what his ideas are.
Well, thank you. Feelings are great. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. Mr. Stefano, this is of course no words of apology. Talking about another ambassador, I would say it's words of appreciation for me as a diplomat. Such people really help us diplomats to bring our position and to bring clarifying situation in Ukraine and about Ukraine. So I will be very shortly, as it was said earlier, my name is Artem Rybchenko. I'm the new ambassador of Ukraine to Swiss Confederation. I was appointed end of summer. On end of August, I passed over my credential letters to President Basset. And this was actually the beginning of my appointment. And starting 1st of September, I'm as a student in our country, which students start 1st of September usually, so I was ready to present my country and the school year as well. And I'm really great to have this opportunity because today we hear a lot about Ukraine. And unfortunately, it's not always something positive. We hear about war, we hear about corruption and some other issues, and we have to talk about this for sure. And we have to talk about clarification facts about the war, about the aggression, as well as talking about the reforms which are on the way. And I would like to mention that there are a lot of successful stories about Ukraine. Very often I've been asked, "You're so young, ambassador." I say, "Well, yes, I have a very diplomatic answer. I'm older than Chancellor Kurz in Austria, and we have talked about Austria today shortly." And I used to be a deputy head of the diplomatic mission just before I arrived to Bern, and it was actually the direct flight from Vienna to Bern for my mission. And we really had a lot really interesting events, and I'm working on having the same at some point challenge, but on the other hand, it's already some projects just to be realized. And talking about reforms, back to this very important issue, starting with the new president team, we have a very important 2020 strategic reform strategy. And it's about 20 reforms, actually 20 spheres of reforms, law and tax, medicine, justice, and so on and so on. And talking about business, these are the concrete steps to protect business, to protect foreign business, to protect international investments. And end of August, there was an ambassador meeting in Kyiv, which happens every second year, just like in Switzerland with my colleagues, diplomats from Swiss. They come all over the world and they meet with the president, with the prime minister, like in our case, and with most of ministers, and we discuss all issues, starting from medicine, culture, to business, and some military issues. Unfortunately, this is also another big set of things to be discussed, but not maybe today. And there was a question of my colleague, ambassador in one of the countries. He says, okay, reforms on the way, business is growing, economy is growing, more investors are coming to our country, but there are some cases are going on which are not very good for image of our country. And the answer was very simple. There are, of course, mechanisms that work day to day, 24/7. But if there is a case of, concrete, and that's why we're ambassadors for in all over the world, all countries, capitals and not only capitals, please have all such cases, contact the embassy, and you always have a hand of president, of the prime minister's team, and there are two very important offices for you to know. This is an office of expert office, it's called. It's under the Minister of Economies. And also there is an expert invest office under the finance minister. And actually these mechanisms are very modern, very vast thinking and doing as well, which is also very important. And we, embassies, are here to help. And very important to underline that probably now it's the best time to invest in Ukraine, because we hear a lot, as mentioned earlier, about some issues, some things going on, but it's on the east part of our country. Our country is by territory larger than Germany, so for you to understand, it's really big country. And we have sea, we have mountains, we have agro is #1 business in Europe coming from Ukraine. IT industry is very well known all over the world for doing outsource, high quality and really good prices for that. So I would just to underline that I will pass over my contacts. I have done it earlier, and in any case I'm very open, I'm very flexible, and I'm ready to discuss, to help, just to inform about different spheres of business or culture or medicine, whatever. And I'm really thankful once again to Irina, to our diplomat, to our ambassador, for having me today here with you. I won't take longer because Irina is the main speaker today. But once again, please do contact me. There are a lot of things I haven't said because, I mean, time is limited and the country is big. And the only thing is that I very apologize. I might be leaving a bit earlier because I have to be on the wheel soon. Very glad to be here once again. Thank you to all attention, and thank you, Irina and Mr. Stefano, for having us today. Thank you.
Before I say a few words about modern today's Ukraine, I just wanted to introduce our little team Ukraine. And this is, of course, Artem, and this is Natasha Barbey, who is Ukrainian, unlike me. I'm an imposter Ukrainian. She's real Ukrainian, coming from Cherkasy region in Ukraine. And she lives here in Geneva. So she's also, like me, traveling all over, you know, and having insider view, outsider view as well. And the last but not least member of Team Ukraine is Stefano, because Stefano actually traveled with us through Ukraine with his wife and two wonderful daughters. We, in August, made a one-week trip around Western Ukraine, and then he went also to Odessa. So he wanted to pay his respects to this Italian founder of Odessa. So, you know, Stefano at the end also will probably give some criticism of what he heard today. So, you know, to finish the historical background, I just want to mention one more fact. Ukraine under Soviet rule was nuclear state, nuclear republic. No, Ukraine. Yeah. So Ukraine had a lot of nuclear weapons. The Soviets, you know, they distributed nuclear weapons in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. When Ukraine became independent, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, deployed on the Ukrainian soil. I remember this time, you know, I always was very connected with the US Embassy, and because I studied in the United States, so, you know, I knew all the ambassadors. And at that time, this was early 90s, the United States started pressuring Ukraine to give away the nuclear weapons. And Ukrainians it was a new state, they just became an independent state. They didn't have any experience, they didn't know how to negotiate. So Ukrainians were saying, look, we cannot give away our nuclear arsenal. We are not going to use it, but for us, it's insurance. We have a neighbor next door, former empire. So if any time, they want to attack us, we have nuclear weapons. So we will be protected by our nuclear weapons. And this went on and on. So Clinton came to Ukraine, and the US demanded that Ukraine gives away its nuclear weapons because they wanted to keep everything, all nuclear weapons in one place. And Ukrainians are said, okay, to whom you want us to give away? And they said to Russia. So, the Ukrainian president was very reluctant, and he said, okay, how you guarantee our independence and our, safety and our security? And unfortunately, again, because of our inexperience, the US, the UK, and Russia, they said, we will sign a memorandum with you. You give us nuclear weapons, everything, and instead we sign a piece of paper which, as an international lawyer, I believe that it's binding, because for Ukraine it was binding. So it means it was binding for everybody else. And this piece of paper was called Budapest Memorandum. This was signed in Budapest by President Clinton, by President Yeltsin, and by Ukrainian President, I think, Kushma was at that time, Kravchuk, still Kravchuk, yeah. So, this memorandum was signed. It was put somewhere, everybody forgot about this memorandum. And then, when Russia attacked Ukraine, Ukrainians started asking around, United States, UK, why you are not guaranteeing our independence, our territorial integrity. And of course, nobody wanted to go for Ukraine to war. So they said, but we are helping you. We're helping you with money. We're helping you with this. But that's not what the memorandum says. The memorandum says they guarantee territorial integrity. So there is no actually implementation of this memorandum. And when the Russians were asked, but your president signed this memorandum as well, and they said he was drunk. He was always drunk. So when he signed the memorandum, he was drunk. So that was the response. So that's a historic fact that Ukraine voluntarily gave away the third biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, and that was probably a mistake. Probably it was a mistake, because if we didn't give it away, we wouldn't be having those problems that we are having today. So on history of Ukraine in English, there is a very good book by American professor Timothy Snyder, and the book is called Bloodlands. And that's the book I can recommend if anybody is interested in the history. So coming back to the modern Ukraine, with all these bloodlands and terrible things and tragedy, etc., you may expect a very depressed, country in a difficult situation, but it's actually not the case. This August, I had a big party because my daughter is getting married in New York in December, and she's Ukrainian, but her fiancé is from New York. So we decided to make pre-wedding festivities in Ukraine, in Kiev, and I had about 60 friends from all over the world coming to Kiev for several days for those festivities, and Stefano Maura and his daughters were there as well. And they couldn't believe the beauty, the dynamism, the energy of Kiev and of Ukraine. They all fell in love. They just said, they had no idea, because from what they read, in the newspapers, what they see on television, they thought it would be a very depressive situation, etc. Actually, Kiev is owned by young people. I don't know if you know about this hipster movement, but Berlin used to be the hipster capital of Europe. Now it's Kiev is the hipster capital of Europe. It's a very highly energetic city. It's also a gourmet capital of the region. The restaurants there are just excellent from all over the world, and some of the best ones are Italian restaurants. Because, full, always full, yes. Actually, I wanted to show some parallels between Italians and Ukrainians. Again, as an outsider, I can do that. For what I saw in Ukraine when I came and through all my years there, that it's a very romantic nation. Ukrainians are very romantic. They have romantic mentality, which is parallel to Italian as well. Also, beautiful music, very melodic language, and great sense of fashion. We love Italian fashion, but lately Ukrainian fashion became also very important. And you can see a lot of celebrities wearing Ukrainian designers, Ukrainian vyshyvanka today, when you see in the window shops of Prada and others. So Italians are taking a little bit from our fashion as well, which is great. But also, when Ukrainians go to Italy, and many of them work in Italy, they pick up language very, very, very easily, and they very easily immerse into the culture, and they become sort of, very fluent in the language, in the culture, etc. So, despite of Ukraine and Italy not having any common borders, I personally see a lot of parallels between these two nations. And if you have a chance to hear Ukrainian folk songs, you will understand very quickly, how beautiful they are, how romantic, and I think you will relate easily to that. So coming back to Kiev today, to Ukraine today, there are several industries that are driving the progress and driving new Ukraine, and those industries are agro, as Artem has mentioned, and IT. Ukrainians are probably the best IT programmers in the world today, because most of the major IT companies, they have their hubs in Ukraine, or they hire Ukrainian IT specialists. And initially, they were all working on so-called research and development contracts. So they were only working as contractors to Google, to Microsoft. This was even like 10 years ago. I remember at that time the CEO of Microsoft was Ballmer, Steve Ballmer. I don't remember exactly his first name. And all of a sudden, he shows up in Kiev. And I said, what he's doing in Kiev? And turns out they have one of the most important research and development centers in Kiev. So I went to this meeting with him, and there were about 200 programmers, Ukrainian IT specialists, and they were speaking the same language with him. I didn't understand anything personally, but they were at the same level, when they were having their discussions. So, and this was kind of not a secret, but it's under the radar screen, that it has been happening already for decades. But today it's all open, and also a lot of Ukrainians that started as contractors now make their own startups. They make their own companies. They make. There are, I think, a couple of Ukrainian startups that become what they are called unicorn, made 1 billion, raised $1 billion. Some of the very famous IT companies actually have Ukrainians as co-founders. I think WhatsApp and some others as well. So that's the industry that is driving Ukraine straight into globalization. And of course, my generation, we don't understand much into this. And I remember I was at the big international conference, International Bar Association, and we had a roundtable discussion, and the younger lawyers, they were talking about blockchain, smart contracts, and I was moderating this discussion. So I knew about those things, but not very well. And there was one more mature partner from Argentina, managing partner of a law firm in Argentina, and he was like saying, yeah, that's very important, blockchain, yeah, when I come back to my law firm, I'll make sure we introduce this, da 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 da. And when the conference finished, he came to me and he said, Irina, what the hell is blockchain? So, young Ukrainians know exactly what is blockchain. They know exactly, what is smart contracts. They're very, very advanced. And now and many of them were self-taught, because there were no universities before that were teaching IT or software. Now there are many schools, that teach IT, teach modern technologies, and yes, yes, and they find job immediately. So lawyers no longer can find a job, but IT easy. So those are the industries that are moving the country forward. But one thing I think that is most important, more important than business, more important than anything else, is culture. And without culture, there will be no soul of the nation. As Italians, you know, because Italian culture, Italian language is the center of your nation. Same with Ukraine. Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language is the center of Ukrainian soul. So we see a renaissance of Ukrainian culture. We see that, like 10, 15 years ago, the best, most talented Ukrainian artists left. Today, many of them stay or come back. When you come to the opera house in Kiev, Kiev has a beautiful opera house, and there are, I don't know how, dozens of opera houses all over Ukraine, in Odessa, in Chernivtsi, in Lviv, everywhere. But in Kiev, it's of course the national opera. And you can be at the opera at the level of Metropolitan Opera. I go to Metropolitan Opera very often, and there I pay probably like $300 per ticket. Kiev Opera, I pay $10, and I see the same level, and I see the same stars. Because like one of the top sopranos in the world today is Lyudmila Monastyrska, and she sings in La Scala, she sings in Metropolitan a lot. And then, you know, she is very big patriot of her country, so she comes and sings in Kiev Opera all the time, or in Odessa. I was at her performance in Odessa recently. And they don't take, you know, money for their performances because they know that, you know, with ticket of $10, they cannot make a lot of money, but they come. Yes, yes, and a lot of them stayed, like the New Era Orchestra that we are all supporting, and Ambassador was supporting them as well. They are all young, talented musicians that are in Ukraine. They travel, they perform, but they are based in Ukraine. So this culture, I think, very, very important. And I'm very happy to see the renaissance of Ukrainian culture, of Ukrainian science, of Ukrainian identity. And I want to invite all of you to come to Ukraine. Not only Kiev. Kiev is great. I'm in love with Kiev. That was my first love. When I came to Ukraine, I came to Kiev. And that's my city. I walk streets of Kiev and I tell myself, this is my city. Really. And then, you know, if you go to Odessa, where Stefanov went, he can tell you stories about his Odessa trip. And then, you know, we went to Western Ukraine. You go to Kharkiv, which is one of the former capitals of Ukraine. It's a city of scientists and culture. So all over, this is a great, great country. I want you to come. I will be happy to give you my contact information. Contact me when you come, and we will be happy to welcome you. And I want to thank you very, very much for your attention, for listening about our wonderful Ukraine. And Mr. President, thank you very much for the invitation. And Stefano for organizing this. And I want now Stefano to give his comments as well.
I will take this opportunity, passing the microphone just on the way, very shortly. Once you come to Ukraine, you will enjoy and you'll come back, that's for sure. But very important that coming from Switzerland, it is actually around the corner. Every day flight from Geneva, every day flight from Zurich directly to Kyiv. No visa. I mean, it's really just for a weekend or for a long weekend. Please, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will not take very much because I know that you probably want to ask questions to Irina and not to me. But I would like to tell you a couple of things. Well, first of all, in Ukraine there are business opportunities. Irina mentioned that DuPont has been there for 40 years, more or less, active in the agribusiness. Ukraine was known since ever as being the granary of Europe. So all the ag company are active there since a long time. But I want to say a couple of things, and I jot them down because I'm not sure I will remember all the things. But I want to say a couple of things about what I saw concerning Italy in Ukraine. And this, for me, was quite surprising because you normally don't expect to see a large presence of Italian history in Ukraine. I will just mention a few things. In Lviv, which in Italian is called Leopoli. The biggest and the most beautiful palace in the central square, which reminds very much the central square of Krakow, was built by an Italian merchant called Bandinelli from Florence in the 16th century. It's probably the most beautiful Renaissance palace in Eastern Europe, and I didn't expect that. I was quite shocked to see anything like that. Another major building in the central square of Lviv is the residence of a Venice ambassador. You can still see the San Marco lion on the facade, I think there's once or twice. So you don't expect again this numerous presence of Italian merchants and business people in the 16th century in that country. Another incredible presence is the presence, or well, now it's not clear where the Crimea stays, but in Crimea you have many colonies from both Venice and Genoa. The most important of them was a city called Feodosia today. At that time was called Caffa, which was probably the most important colony of Genoa outside its borders. It was also sadly famous because there the Black Plague started. It was in fact a ship, La Peste Nera, a ship leaving Caffa at the time when Caffa was under siege from the Tatars, that came to Venice and brought the famous epidemic of pest in Europe in 1347-48. All these colonies were conquered by the Ottomans later on, and so we've lost this tradition. But again, and Caffa is just one, there are several all around the Black Sea and several in Crimea. And then, I guess, one cannot talk about the Italian presence in Ukraine without talking about Odessa. There has been recently a researcher of Russian origin, Mikolkian is her name. She's teaching in Toronto, and she has written a couple of books about Odessa as the last Italian cities outside of Italy, and notably around the Black Sea. I mean, Odessa, as you know, was like St. Petersburg. It's an artificial city. It was created from zero by Catherine the Great, as Peter the Great built St. Petersburg again, to some extent, taking inspiration from cities like Venice. Catherine the Great wanted to build a new city on the Black Sea where there is no ice, and she invited a lot of people from all over Europe, but especially from Italy. The first governor of Odessa is a guy from Naples called De Ribas, and he had, I think, foreign parents. I mean, his father was from Naples, from Spain, and his mother was Irish, but he was born and grew up in Naples, and he considered himself from a Neapolitan citizen. And he joined the Russian army at some point in time, and he became the first governor. He brought with him a large number of architects, artists, merchants from Italy, to the point that, and it's not me, I'm quoting Pushkin here. I hope I got it right. He said, "The tongues of golden Italy resound happily across the pavement," because he was living in Odessa for a few years. He was exiled in Odessa, and he had several adventures there, including the wife of a governor, which of course the governor didn't like him very much. And he also had an Italian lover, a lady called Amalia from Florence, and he liked Italian very much. And he was kind of surprised by the fact that Italian there was largely spoken, and it was in fact considered kind of a lingua franca, especially in business, to the point that since it was a Portofranco, the bank which managed the Portofranco was called the Portofranco Banca in Italian. Italian words were commonly used in commerce, and a large number of documents, business documents, commercial documents, were written in Italian. One of the main streets in Odessa used to be called Italianskaya. Now it's called Kupushinskaya. The name has been changed, but it was to some extent, I would say, I'm not exaggerating here, but a kind of a copy of Genoa and Turin and Naples on the Black Sea. And of course, this large presence diminished already after the unification of Italy, because many of the Italians who were there decided to go back to Italy, and then eventually disappeared after the communist revolution, because of course not many of these Italians wanted to stay under communist rule. Those who stayed didn't end up very well, especially those in Crimea, because there was a large agricultural colony from south of Italy in central Crimea, which was eventually displaced to Kazakhstan by Stalin, and unfortunately with the help of Togliatti and friends, which wasn't a very good idea, because of course they had to indoctrinate them, and that was a sad end of the story. But if I can continue like this by giving many other examples, I don't want to bother you. I just want to give you a couple of visible examples. One is, the famous Potemkin stairs. The Potemkin stairs, in fact, they were called the big stairs in the old days. Potemkin is after the movie on the Cuirassier Potemkin, which was made by, remind me the name of the movie director? Sorry? Eisenstein, yeah. But before they were just called the big steps, and because they are the connection between the center of Odessa and the harbor. And these were built by an Italian architect called Boffo. The stock exchange, the old stock exchange in Odessa, which used to be on the Italianskaya street, was built by another Italian architect called Bernardazzi. We were having dinner last day before we left in a restaurant which is in the middle of the old stock exchange, which is now the place of a Philharmonic Orchestra. You had the impression of being in Palazzo Strozzi, because it was exactly copied from that type of architecture. And the opera house which exists today, which is the symbol of Odessa. By the way, Odessa, since it was a new city, it was not built around the cathedral. It was built around the opera house. It's a like version of a modern ideal city, where you don't put the cathedral in the center, you put the center of the cultural activities. And the first opera house was again designed by an Italian architect from Naples, Frappolli. When it was burnt, it was destroyed, and the second one was designed by Austrian architects. But so these are just a few examples of the number of connections between the two countries, which I found, at least for my case, extremely surprising. There are two other similarities between Ukraine and Italy, if I may say. One is the diversity. I mean, you see extreme differences from one part of the country to the others, also because of historic traditions. I mean, Lviv was under Austrian rule, and the eastern part of Ukraine is closer to Russia, of course. Similarities which sometimes are considered a problem, which I think it's a form of richness, like in Italy. And the other one is that it was always ruled by somebody else. And so like Italy, it has a weak state in a sense, because the state is kind of recent, and it doesn't have a long tradition like you have in England or France, where the state has been there for 1,000 or 1,500 years. But despite of this weakness, it's rediscovering its cultural roots, and I think that is a little bit like Italy. It has a rich cultural background, which can certainly be an attraction also for the future, because I think it's an interesting tourist destination. Thank you very much.